All right. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. We should be fluent with this system by now, but we're still learning as we go. So let me get my screen set up, and we're going to spend the next 2 minutes or so letting the rest of your attendees get into this session, and then we will get started again. Here we are. All right, and I will share my screen. Okay, presenting team, are we good?
We are good.
Okay. All right, so I have a quarter after the hour, and again, welcome everybody. This is going to be part 2 of our series today. We're going to kind of pause and wait a minute or so as we see folks coming into this session. So it looks like we're about halfway there. You can see the numbers tick up on our end as everybody logs in. Wish we had a way of folks quickly letting us know if they were in this morning's session in C1 or not. Can't think of what that might be exactly. But for those of you who were with us, and I assume most are, we're going to highlight quickly again at the start of this some of the core messages that we started with in the last session as well. So know that that's coming up. There's a phrase we use, which is repetition builds fluency. And we've been researching and doing this work for a couple of decades now. And we, even as the researchers and implementers, we all learn messages even after we've heard them hundreds and hundreds of times. So it's actually a good thing that we do a quick highlight again of the core messages around Pbis before we get specifically into the practices component of this work. So we're about 2 minutes in here. How about I do some of the housekeeping slides? If I could just remind everybody that please follow these expectations again for our sessions. We'd like you to be responsible, be kind, and be safe. So for being responsible for today's session, it's going to be using chat, be on topic with your chat, and maybe identify yourselves. We'll talk about that in a minute, but kind of help us help you. Let us know your role, your organization as well when we are chatting. You know, you're already here, so you know how to get your registered sessions. If this, for some reason, is your very first activity in this platform, our pictures are on the left of the screen. On the right, you'll see the tabs for chat, polls, files, and people. So you can navigate those. Right now, we're pretty much on chat. We'll show you the other tabs as we go on. You might accidentally navigate away from this page if you click on the wrong thing in your browser. It happens all the time. No problem. Just go back to your agenda, find the card for today's session, and then log back in. You'll only miss about 30 seconds or so. If you have any technical issues, click on that help desk, and there is a sort of a self-help section. We also have a live team who's manning a support room in case that's needed. All right. So for the norms for today, this is specifically around how we're going to put together. We'd like for you, when you're chatting, to include first your district name and your state, and then also maybe your title, because we can shape the responses we give you from our chat panelists if it's a state team member, a district team member, a school team member, if you're an administrator or you're a teacher or a clinician. So that perspective helps us maybe quickly to narrow in on maybe the core of what your question might be. So consider doing that in chat. That would be really helpful to us. We will prompt you to participate in polls. That'll come up soon, and we'll ask you to do that. And then if you want to see the handouts, or if you want the handouts, I should say, those will be in the Files tab as well. Okay, so again, the first about 10 slides here. If you were on the C1 session, you saw these before. I'm going to hit them quickly again with highlights. Again, repetition builds fluency. So you should get comfortable being able to share these same messages, hopefully by the second or third time today. So the first piece is this idea of a framework and the metaphor of the bicycle, which is a great metaphor. We should have had this 20 years ago. Your school are all of these important components, as you can see on the left, but we need to make sure that they're organized. Although that's a very organized picture of a bicycle, I will say that, or bicycle parts. But what we need in our schools is a framework, something to connect everything together. And Pbis serves as that framework. And so on the right-hand side, you can see some of those core components and how they connect to this metaphor. So who's going to be making the decisions? Well, that's your school team, a representative group of your community and your staff and your administrators and student voice. They're sitting in the seat making decisions. Someone needs to help steer that team, though, maybe with a little more expertise. That's going to be your coaches. Your problem-solving process, that's that frame, connecting all of these pieces together. Your leadership for your school's extremely important. So they're the gear shifter. They're kind of picking the lane and the speed and the pace at which we're going in some cases. The wheels, the rubber hitting the road, that's the implementation of your work. And then the overall drive. Those might be the pedals in this case. So I love that metaphor. It's really useful. Consider using that as needed as well. And also another way that we organize the thinking around this work was from our return to school publications, where we conceptualized it through these components. So at your schools, can we first learn how to connect with our students in our community? So those kind of core relationship building concepts. Can we then screen our students in our community for what's needed? What are the social, emotional, behavioral supports that they need? Can we have a mechanism for providing supports? And then can we teach? Can we be explicit, direct instruction of skills related to social, emotional, and behavioral? And then finally, monitoring. Let's use data for decision making. On October 19th, just a few days ago, the U.S. Department of Ed, Office of Special Education Programs published a seminal work. It's about 100 pages or so. It's amazing. And it was representative of multiple technical assistance centers. If you read this and you read every word, which you should, it will scream to you what you know if you've been doing our work for the last 20 years. So how do we help students with their social, emotional, behavioral, mental health needs? Here's the quick set of recommendations that they've identified, but then they use this document to go in deeper and talk about the strengths and the challenges schools face as they're doing this work. What I'm going to highlight is number 4. If you're going to support the social, emotional, behavioral, mental health wellness of your students, you need a framework, something to integrate, to pull all of this together. It is not done just by looking at data one time or doing screening outside of the context of supports, or picking up a curriculum off the shelf and say, let's teach this year. It's a framework where we have to look at all of it together. So excellent resource. It is absolutely worth your time to take a look at it. The other thing that comes to mind when we talk about getting started with this work is this idea of the birth and death cycles of educational innovations. And if you've implemented Pbis before, maybe you've experienced this. Maybe your school did this 15 years ago. Then you did it again 10 years ago. And here you are again saying, okay, we still have the same needs, but we're not sticking with the fidelity of the work, or we have to kind of relearn what it is with the latest research. We want to avoid this trap. And Pbis can be just as susceptible to this, this idea of this 4-year cycle. So we always say it takes 3 to 5 years to implement with fidelity, but just because you get the fidelity doesn't mean you sustain there. You have to continue to attend to the framework itself. So Rob Horner had said a little while back, it might take 3 to 5 years to get to fidelity. Don't do anything in your schools unless you're committing to it for the next 10 years. And I think that that's a better way to go about this work. When we look at the components of Pbis, this connects back to that birth and death cycle of educational innovations. Even though things have come and gone over the past 20, 30, 40 years, PBIS has remained relevant during that time. And the reason is, regardless of the focus of your particular community or district or school, Pbis is going to ask you to look at it from these core components: outcomes, data, practices, systems, and equity. And when you keep things in that overly simple light, it does help you to ask the question of, how do we take whatever's important to us and organize it? So what you have on the screen here is my most simple definition we can come up with, the fewest words possible to explain PBIS. Hope this is helpful to you. We have a much more thorough definition slide, or you can dig into all the research on it. But if you have to put it in front of your colleagues, this might be where you start with keeping things simple. When we look at those components, this is what they mean. Outcomes means, what are you currently getting in your school, your organization? What are the outcomes? And where do you want to go? Helps you set your objectives and your goals. Data is what we use to support our decision making. These are all connected to each other. So that should be connected to those outcomes. What are you already getting? But what's the data say about how and why we're getting there? How do we support staff is our systems. So what are the structures that we have in place that build the confidence and competence of our educators? And then finally, practices. How do we support our students? And that's where I snuck in that little triangle to kind of remind you that what we're talking about is a tiered approach to practices. What are we doing for all students? How do we give additional doses for students that need some more? How do we individualize further for students that need more than that? You might be very familiar with MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. That's becoming more and more frequently stated and heard everywhere. There's about at least one definition per state or more. But there's a lot of common threads across MTSS. We at our Midwest team here use these 6 components from McIntosh and Goodman, their 2016 publication. And whether yours is a little different than this or not, that's okay. You'll probably find the commonalities. But what I want to point out is 80% of the research that's gone into MTSS is the Pbis framework research. It's informed a substantial portion of it. And so when we talk about MTSS, you should be thinking that Pbis is the social, emotional, behavioral MTSS framework. And this is what that looks like. Under systems, those MTSS components include team-based leadership and coordination, professional development, coaching, and content expertise. Under data, we're talking about regularly monitoring the fidelity of your system and your practices, progress monitoring the outcomes of your efforts, and universal screening, so we can figure out what does our whole community need and which students need more. And then practices, again, is that 3-tiered continuum. So this is how those connect together. Hopefully that will be helpful to see. I went through these kind of individually on our first round. I'm just going to point out that these are some of the big kind of takeaways from the summary so far. The guiding principles of when you're implementing a Pbis, what we can expect and how we want you and your organization to think about this work. If you implement with fidelity, like measured, if you measure your work and you're saying, compared to other schools, we are having the components in place, you should see these outcomes compared to similar schools like yours that are not implementing with fidelity. So there's a strong evidence base to this. If you go into pbis.org and you look up the evidence base, we have a really great spreadsheet that if you're a doctoral student, it's the place to start. You can look at every study under every subject that we have. But what you'll see here for your schools are improved student outcomes in these categories, reduced use of exclusionary discipline practices, and improved outcomes for teachers as well. So 3 broad categories, but a quick kind of snapshot of why you want to implement this work, but also why you want to implement it the way it's supposed to be done, or with fidelity. Okay, and then I'm going to highlight these fairly quickly, talk about these at the beginning. But when we organize our schools and we say, well, how do we get started with this work? One way to go about it is the structure I'm going to share with you. So start with teaming. Who's the decision makers? Let's get the right team together. Let's make sure it's representative, has family and community and student voice, is representative of your colleagues and the staff doing the work. And once we have that team, they can help represent the rest of the community and say, what's the vision for our school? And how are we going to define that through 3 to 5 expectations? You have a vision and expectations. The next step is to task analyze those. Let's say, what should those expectations look like when I am in the chemistry lab? Or what should they look like when we're getting on, we're getting off the buses and into the school in the morning? So let's be specific about it so then we know exactly what to teach. And then that's that next step, which is you should have curriculum. Curriculum that specifically is teaching what do we expect in our school, how do we show it, and how do we build maybe the sub skills needed for it. Now that you've taught and you have expectations and rules and you've taught them, the next step is to provide performance feedback. So hitting that 5-to-1 ratio, letting students know this is what you're doing well, this is what we want you to keep doing, and where needed, when you're also going to correct behaviors too. And speaking of which, when there are behavioral challenges or errors or students need more support, the next part you need is a system for preventing and responding. And that means getting all of our teachers to see the same behavior similarly, to categorize it the same way. What is disruption, for example? And then for us to respond in a similar way so that students see consistency by the adults. And then finally, what's the data say about all this? And while data might be last here, it can also be the start. And that's what we're going to start with today. That's what we did start with today in session C1. What we're going to do now, if I take a look at how these map onto the tiered fidelity inventory, for those of you who are familiar with that, we're going to look at this big section here, which for us are the practices. That's this continuum, starting with what's the vision and expectations, all the way through to how do adults interact with students and respond to problem behaviors. So you'll see on the right side of the screen, we'll keep this up and we'll move this circle around a little bit here or there. But for the most part, we're going to be trying to cover these middle 5 boxes throughout the rest of this session. So this is a great time. If you haven't already, we have 5 questions we'd love for you to answer in the polls. And these questions, for those of you who know the tiered fidelity inventory, map directly to that tool as well. And we have the little tips up there, 1.3, 1.4, et cetera. But go ahead and just answer this question to the best of your ability, representing your school or your district, kind of where you're at. Give it your best shot. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Heather's going to pick it up from here and introduce our chat panelists.
Hi, everyone. Good to see so many of you back. So thank you so much for coming back. And for those of you that are brand spanking new, I'm Heather George. I'm professor at University of South Florida and a co-director of the National Center on PBIS, as well as the Florida PBIS project. So if you are in C1, which it looks like so far, as I'm looking at the chat box, you guys have the opportunity to ask questions directly to exemplars. And so we have 3 new exemplars that are here. And before I turn it over to them, want to give you a heads up. Brian had talked about the norms that when you put something in the chat box, when you're asking specific questions, it would be really helpful. As just a quick reminder, again, just say I'm like district name, the state, and your position, so that our 3 exemplars can figure out which of the 3 would be the best to answer your question on that. But I'm going to turn it over to our very first exemplar.
Hello all, good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Lauren Ivanovich. I am a research associate professor and a TA specialist on the Florida PBIS project. So I get the pleasure of getting to work with Heather on our statewide project. I'm really excited to be here, and I kind of bring that more systemic approach. So systems level pieces, although I was a high school teacher and implementer of PBIS as well. So I'm excited you're here, and thanks for joining, and look forward to chatting with you.
Thanks, Lauren. Welcome. And Tara.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tara Davis. I'm the PBIS and Climate Coordinator for Forsyth County Schools. We're located just northeast of Atlanta. I've been in the PBIS world for almost 17 years now, and I've had the opportunity to work in many different states and serve as a school coach, district coordinator. I've been a regional coach and a state TA for Georgia. So please feel free to reach out and just ask any questions. We'll do the best we can to answer them. Thank you for attending today.
Thanks for being here, Tara. And Juan.
Hi, everyone. I am Juan Lira. I am a principal at an elementary school out in School District U46 in Elgin, Illinois. This is my 10th year as principal there. I've been involved with PBIS probably for about 15 years or so in one way or another, working to implement and install PBIS practices in the buildings that I have been in. So I hope I can lend a hand and answer some questions in the chat today. And to my fellow Chicagoans who I see are in the room, or folks from Illinois, go Bulls. We got a good looking team. All right.
Awesome. Thanks, Juan. And I'd say go Bucks because we just beat the Bears the other day. So, and I'm a fellow Chicagoan, but you got to adapt in your new environment, right?
Okay,
Right.
now I have to say go Braves now. Okay.
You're right. You're right. All right. Well, as you guys, if you were in the C1 section, you'll know that when you go to these slides, if you have an additional question to follow up for one of our exemplars, they've got their email addresses on there. There's more background info, and we have one of their quotes specific to around practices. But folks were selected as the exemplars for the data practices systems, different sessions based upon their area of expertise. And when we know that they just really thrive in that area. They thrive in all of the areas, but we had to pick one of the three. So please use this time to pick their brain, take their trade secrets, borrow their trade secrets, whatever, because I think, you're going to learn a lot from them in this process of putting that in the chat box. If you were also in C1, you'll have noticed that we are constantly looking at the chat that's happening in Pathables, as well as we have another chat that's happening in our Zoom room and sharing certain things. And so, for example, somebody in the last session had said, hey, there's a broken link. And we went and found it and got that corrected link in there. So again, we want to try to make this as real life and not that it's not real life now, but as interactive as possible. And given that we cannot be officially face-to-face. All right, so the last session we talked about data and the whole area around using that data to help us identify what the problem areas are. And another part of that data piece can also help us. We're not only identifying where the problem areas are, but it also helps us, based upon those problem areas, what is it that we need to improve on our school campus or within our district or within our state, and how that data can actually help us determine how we're going to shape this social culture and this more positive climate on our campus. And so one way to do that is we've got to think about what's our vision. So if we've had lots of fights that have happened on the school campuses and everything, you got to think about what is it that you want to have? What is it, your dream for your students? Is it that you would love them to be problem solvers and be able to say, like, listen, I'm struggling with this, and ask for help, as opposed to just punch somebody because they're frustrated? You've got to think that way, because from that information, it can help you determine what is it that we need to start teaching kids in relation to behaviors. What is that common experience that we can start to have folks build upon? What's the common language that we can use in this process so that we're all consistent, we're all cohesive in how we're supporting everybody, and how that is based upon this common vision? And one way to pull that common vision together is for folks to talk and have all of your faculty, ideally, and your staff talk about what are the values, what's the vision for your school, to get folks on the same page, so that when you do start to come up and talk about, here's our school-wide expectations across campus, this is how we're going to teach you, that you guys are all clear as the adults how you're creating this effective organization, essentially. And then you're all working together to help each other when you're teaching the students and supporting the students in displaying those expectations. And essentially, it's sharing the values across all. So thinking about what is it ideally that we want. We need to prevent behavior. And honestly, that is the foundation of PBIS. It's about that prevention piece. And so it's about being deliberate and continuously rearranging and teaching and using that environment to be that place to have that teaching. But we also need to look at how we're encouraging learning, how we're, what are those displays of this pro-social behavior, look at how we can discourage certain learning and displays of antisocial behavior, which would mean we're changing the way in which we're responding to problem behavior. And how we're going to do that is we're going to directly teach social skills. We're going to practice them in the classroom, in the hallway, in the cafeteria. We're going to reteach behavior errors because we're human, we make mistakes. And like Brian had said earlier, practice, practice, practice. We've got to practice in order to have this become second nature for us. Providing that positive feedback and recognition. And remember, it's not just the kids, it's the adults too. So in order to be able to teach these new skills to kids, we're going to have to model that expected behavior for the kids. We're going to have to add prompts for them, give them cues, maybe pre-correct them. We want to become much less reliant on waiting for problem behavior to occur and reacting. We really want to set the stage and prevent as much at the very beginning. But by doing this too, we're also going to be able to cue and prompt the rest of the adults in this process because we're all jumping on board and practicing something new on our school campus as well. The goal is we want to obviously maximize academic success, and we're going to need to actively supervise. So in order to move towards creating that positive school climate, it's about establishing common expectations. Those common expectations then help us develop what our common language is going to be across our school campus. And then from that, we're having common routines and experiences. So for you to think about in different parts of the country, we could say we want kids to be respectful. Okay, well, respect might look different in Chicago, for example, versus how it looks in the South. And I remember that moving for the first time to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I realized if I don't address somebody with ma'am or sir first, I'm not going to get the same level of response from adults. If I did that in Chicago, at least area where I had grown up, I'd probably get punched in the face. So we've got to think about how are we being culturally responsive in our areas. But if we're talking about being respectful, what does that look like on your school campus? And that's that piece of having that dialogue with the adults and even having that dialogue with the students within your classroom. What does that look like? Let's come together. Let's make sure that folks truly understand what we're talking about. Let's come to some common definition of what we are all going to work on together so that we can have this common language and this common experience. In doing so, we've got this continuum of support, and we know that tier 1, we're talking about this impacts everybody, not just the students, but all of the adults as well, all the families, all the classrooms. Nobody's exempt in this process of tier 1. And so depending on where you're coming from, whether you are district level or if you're a classroom teacher, I want you to think about what everybody needs, and that's your tier 1. And so for the classroom teacher, you got to think about what do all of your students need from you. So when we're starting to think about these evidence-based practices to set up this learning environment that's going to be, for pro-social behavior and be responsive and have this positive school climate, what does everybody in your classroom need? If you're the principal, you've got to think about, okay, what is it that all of my classrooms need? What do all of my teachers need to be able to get this set up? And that's going to involve something with, training. It's going to be support. It's going to be, communication and how we're working with folks. But then what do some need? And so for a principal, it might be that, well, some of my teachers might need additional training. It might be that some of my folks need some additional materials based upon the student needs. For your classroom teacher, you could think about, what do some of my students need in addition to what I'm going to be providing at tier 1. So that's that piece that's important, that tier 1 is always available for all at all times and always provided for all. But there's going to be some folks, some kids, adults, classroom environments, schools, however you want to call it, that are going to need a little bit more supports for a variety of reasons. And figuring out, we're using our data, and then now we're going to provide the practices based around that. So I think it's important that if you happen to be somebody who maybe you need the most intensive supports, so you could be a brand new teacher. It could be that you didn't get a whole lot of training on, classroom management, which if you didn't, don't worry, you're not alone. That is a major problem across higher ed, across all countries or all states and even. But think about what additional supports do I need? So you still are going to be expected to implement what the school comes up with at tier 1, but it might be that you also need additional supports, whether it's somebody coming in, they're serving as a mentor to you, you're getting additional training, maybe the principals providing additional supports in your classroom. And sometimes you can be a veteran teacher, you've had it down, and all of a sudden you get this year of the roster and you've got all 5 cousins in your classroom at the same time. And it's like, I'm going to need some extra help here. And so you've got to think about that's using data for decision making. But that's also going to help us set up what we're going to do for practices on our student campus or on our school campus. So looking at a student profile, I think this, is one student essentially. And like I said, nobody's exempt, but rarely, if ever, in fact, I probably would want to throw it out there, never is anybody ever tier 1 all the time for their entire life, let alone their entire time during the education system. If you think about, there were times back in your own time going through elementary school or middle school, where you may have struggled in certain areas, certain content areas. For me, for a while, it was math. For a little while, I struggled during, for a couple of years on that. I needed additional support. I needed tutoring, but I still was part of the main class. I still was expected to be part of that core curriculum for math, but I received additional support with tutoring and additional support from the teacher on the side from that in order to help me so that I could be successful in math. When I built those skills, then I no longer needed that tutoring support. So we've got to think that way with behavior for kids, that not all kids are always stuck in, say, one tiered area where they need the most supports. They actually do have strengths in different areas, and all folks are needing more supports in different places for one reason or another. Brand new parents with a newborn baby. Again, I think that's a classic one where, like, we need help. If anybody can bring dinner at any time, that would be fantastic. That is tier 3 supports, right there. But do they stay in that category forever? No, they don't. So it's the same thing with the kids too. So we really want to be careful not to label students or that not to say that students are on a tier. But we really want to be looking at that there's a structure that we've got in place, and we're using our data to determine who needs additional supports, and we're providing those supports, more intensive supports to them. All right, so invest in evidence-based practices. So let's talk about how do we organize everything for what everybody needs, from what some need to what a few need, knowing that we're focusing this whole strand predominantly on getting started on tier 1. So one way that you can start with this is, we know everybody has something going on their school campus or within their district already related to something around social emotional behavior supports. You may not have gotten officially trained yet in PBIS, but chances are you've got something that your school may have done at some point, may be doing, but may not be necessarily implementing it well. Or you may be implementing it well, and you're trying to figure out, how does this all fit together in this process? So one way to do that is to conduct, you can call it an audit, you can call it, we're going to figure out how we're going to work smarter and list out all of the various social emotional behavior supports that we do provide across our school campus. or you could say across your district, depending where you're coming from. And what is it that you would have for everybody across tiers? You know, what is the date and last time the practice was checked for fidelity? You know, because again, we start all kinds of initiatives like Brian had talked about, but at some point, is there implementation drift that occurs over time, or we've lost the folks who were able to provide supports in that implementation? And so it may be there, but it's not really used. And so then we've got to think about, are students even responding to the interventions that we have committed to? This can help you guys determine, one, what do you have in place, and is it working? Is it not working? Because if something is working, you don't want to get rid of that. But if it's possible that it could work better, you've got to figure out, why isn't it working better? And again, this is that part of, we don't need to reinvent the wheel in this process, but we do need to do an audit to see where we are. Because again, if we're starting to implement PBIS, we also have to think about, there's other folks that we're going to need to bring on board. There's other adults we're going to need to bring on board on our school campus. And what if they're using that one intervention and they were the sole person using it? How do we help them understand how this fits within the PBIS framework? And again, we're going to be talking a lot more about that teaming part in the next session around systems. Brian, do you have anything else to add around this slide?
Yeah, you know, the other thing I'd like to highlight, and you did a great job capturing all of it, is I think we've had a version of this in our training for over 20 years, where we start out by just saying, where are you currently at? What are you doing for all? How do you layer up? And you'll see over time, schools might put things in here that they probably shouldn't put on here, practices that they might not want, or they'll put down lesson plans or the things that they are doing. And it was recently where we sort of rebuilt this, and we sort of learned from what we do at tier 2 teaming work, where we said, if we're going to audit the work at tier 1, let's also ask these 2 other questions. So have we checked that we're doing that thing correctly? So if you have lesson plans, are teachers teaching the lesson plans as frequently and accurately as you want? And then what are we trying to do? What's the goal? What's the data? Like, is this to improve student behavior or to increase students' use of a pro-social skill? What's the goal? And I think if I'm a tier 1 team, this takes some time to put together and organize. You make decisions as you're doing. The kind of thing up front and center all the time, and you sort of organize your team meetings across the year around this idea, which is, hey, maybe next February is a good time for us to check in on the 3rd row and to get an update on the fidelity of our use of the 5-to-1 ratio, for example. Because if we're not checking it, then how do we know anyone's doing it? So that was the idea. Someone asked in chat if this is available. You can just make it right from what you see here. There's nothing ingenious about it really, but I will in chat put in a link to a workbook that we have that I think has this table on there as well.
Thanks, Brian. If you're coming from a district, another thing to think about, there was a district that I've worked with for a number of years, and we asked them to list out what are all of the different interventions across the tiers that the various departments within the district are using or have available to use for schools, to help them understand and say, how can we work smarter within our district? It took some time as they had to go to various different departments to get that filled out. But in the end, just focusing around the social emotional behavior, they found that they had over 165 different types of interventions, trainings, programs, you name it, that they had committed to at some point or another that were available across their 100+ schools. And so then when it got down to saying, okay, when was the last time a formal training was offered around this? Well, then that started to weed things out, because they'd be like, well, that person who did that died, or that person retired, or you know what, nobody's asked for it, so it just collects dust. That was some ways that those things could be crossed off. And again, it's one of those things that if you're at that district level, we've got to figure out how do we create somewhat of a menu for our schools so that they know, like, hey, we're having issues around tier 1. What can you offer us for support? And then the district needs to have, hey, if we offer all of this, here's all of the additional support that goes with it. So it's not just a quick spray and pray professional development approach, but that we also have some coaching supports too, because we know that just going to training alone doesn't tend to have as much impact as we'd hoped once you take that into the classroom. All right, so let's talk about, for those that might be really brand spanking new to PBIS, let's really start to understand the various tiers and what we're talking about. And like I said, when we're talking about tier 1, that's that piece where I say nobody's exempt. We're talking about all. So we want all students to improve their behaviors, all students to be respectful, be responsible. We're going to have to expect that of the adults too. And so that includes not just the teachers, not just the staff, but also the administrators. Also, it means we're going to have to model this for the families as well. So, but we're talking about establishing this foundation and establishing this proactive support, because the goal is to prevent the unwanted behaviors. And we're going to clearly define what's expected for all. And so that's going to involve procedures then for teaching what this looks like, procedures for practicing the expected behaviors across all the settings. And you think about, like, what a great life skill too on being respectful. It's no different than, okay, we may have relied at times for parents to be like, make eye contact, you shake their hand, you know, that type of thing. But we're talking about, you don't have a partner in class and everybody's partnered up. How do we teach the kids that it's okay? Being responsible means you go up to your teacher and you say, I don't have a partner and somebody to work on. And I just shared with you, this is exactly the conversation I had last night at home with one of my high schoolers. So didn't have a partner, and he was like, I was too embarrassed to say, because everybody had partnered up right away and I was the only one without a partner. So he's like, I'd rather take a 0 than being called out that I didn't have anybody to work with. It's like, all right, we got to talk about how it's okay. You got to be responsible. You've got to advocate for yourself, and you've got to let the teacher know. So this is those procedures. We're teaching essentially these life skills that hopefully they can take elsewhere. So we want to have procedures for encouraging these expected behaviors. When we teach them these new skills, how do we encourage them to use these new skills? But then procedures for discouraging problem behaviors. Because again, if it's much easier to yell and throw something across the room to get out of a lesson, I guarantee you we're going to go back, that kid's going to go back to using that one. However, if they have found that there was a different way that they can get help, or they could take a break from the lesson without having to go through all of that, that is a great thing that we all can celebrate. There's also procedures we're setting up for the database decision-making, like when we're looking at the data, when data need to be collected and entered, who's looking at that data, and how we're going to respond to that data. And then there's going to be a family awareness component. Obviously, we need to let the families know what we're doing on our school campus, and then how they can best support at home their child when, say, they're being respectful or they're being responsible at home. There's also evidence-based when we're talking about the class-wide PBIS practices. So when we're talking about tier 1, that does mean all people, all settings. But when we're also looking at, there's some specifics in the classroom. So what does that look like of PBIS? Because majority of our settings should be classrooms that kids are in throughout the day. So it's talking about maximizing structure in the classroom. There's predictable routines. We're teaching and monitoring and reinforcing these expectations. We're actively engaging students. We're using culturally responsive strategies to acknowledge appropriate behavior, but we're also having responsive strategies to respond to inappropriate behavior, all aligned within PBIS. But if you wanted to know specifics about what to do in the classroom, how to do it, there's a whole separate strand just on classroom at this forum. And if it happens to be occurring simultaneously right now, good news is it's recorded and you guys can look at it at any time. All right, so what are some resources for you to get you going? So habits of effective classroom practice. You can click directly on this brief right here, and it should take you directly to there. But this is something that we had developed to kind of help folks, to remind them, like, listen, let's get back on track of what effective classroom practice looks like as it's aligned within the PBIS framework. We've also got a brief on how you integrate that trauma-informed approach within the PBIS framework. So I think it's important for folks to understand that PBIS is not a program, it's not an intervention, but that it's a framework. And so we've got to use our data to determine where the needs are, and then from there, we adjust the practices within it. And so it could be, if we have lots of kids, and again, the pandemic, it's affected everybody in all different ways. It's completely sent folks out of routine of even just kind of basic social skills, walking in single file. A lot of folks are, they have not been practicing that for well over a year. But they've also have had all kinds of other issues, whether there's food insecurity, housing insecurity, how to integrate that trauma-informed approach, those practices within the PBIS framework. So you don't have to throw one out and understand how they all fit together. But those are great resources for you guys to refer to. And again, we're talking about tier 1 overall. Now let's get into tier 2. And again, I'm just talking briefly so you guys have a big picture of what this looks like across the continuum. But tier 2, we're talking about what is for some. Okay, so remember, for some that are getting more targeted supports, they are still accessing and the tier 1 system, our core curriculum. So it's coming up with the method of using our data to identify at-risk students. It's coming up with designing interventions for groups with similar needs. And we're progress monitoring, and we're coming up with some goals for them to work on. They're getting a little bit more instructional time around a particular area than folks that are just part of the tier 1. So keep in mind, they're also receiving tier 1, they just get a little bit more. When we're talking about tier 3, that's typically few folks. It's usually not more than, say, 5% on a student campus, but we're talking about providing intensive supports to a few students that are needing those most intensive supports. Might require additional expertise if the behavior is intense. It may require a functional assessment. It could be very small groups of students, but it is part of this continuum of support. So again, just because a student might be receiving tier 3 supports in a particular area does not mean that they don't get to access the tier 1. Those tier 3 supports should be built on that tier 1 system, but it just means they're getting the most instructional minutes to focus on that skill. For folks that are wondering what this could look like, I like to think of the academic example of reading. So, in order to read, we've got to be able to decode. In order to be a fluent reader, you've got to obviously be practicing, but build in the fluency on that. But you can't build fluency if you don't know how to decode words. And so students might be receiving tier 3 supports on working on the phonics part of it, working on that decoding. Once they start to get the decoding down, their fluency starts to increase. They may not need as much intensive instruction around that particular area, but now they're still continuing to practice building their fluency overall. They're still part of the larger group instruction for reading. They're still accessing that large group instruction, but they're getting specific supports around that particular area that they need help in. Think of that same way for behavior, whether it's kids that are needing more breaks throughout the day, kids that are struggling with, friends or that social aspect of it. It's the same exact process that we're talking about. So how this is all put together is this multi-tiered approach. And so tier 1, we're looking at, these are those core practices for everybody. That is the main prevention that we're talking about. For tier 2, we're intensifying our core for groups of students. And then for tier 3, it's the most intensive support, but we're individualizing it based upon that specific need. So one way that you could look at this is to fill in the blank here. So when you're thinking about the values for your school, the vision for your school, and how do you get everybody on board, you can think about, in order for us to achieve our, and you could put in your school-wide expectations there, the social emotional behavior success of our students. So in order for us to achieve our, PBIS plan, in order for us to, be respectful on our school campus, this is what we need to do. And there's going to be variations of intensity across it based upon what our data say. All right, so teaching the expectations. So that's one thing that I think can get a little tricky for folks at times, where they're like, I don't do behavior, I'm not the special ed person. But I think what's important is that there's still a huge teaching component around it, that just because we're talking about behavior, the social emotional, doesn't mean that we're not teaching it. We can't assume that people know what to do. And so we've got to take kids out to those natural contexts. It doesn't matter how big or small they are. I'm telling you, high school students can benefit on how you're supposed to use the public restroom appropriately and washing your hands. There are plenty of adults today, I see, traveling in the airports that don't wash their hands before we leave. And sometimes I'm like, and we wonder why people are getting sick. Again, got to think about, we've got to make sure that we're covering our bases and that people know what the expectations are. Lining up, being clear what that is. Again, you can't assume people know what to do. So you've got to make sure they're taught and recognized in that natural context. This, the one with the drinking fountain or the water fountain, depending where you are located across the country, I'll refer to it different ways. They have, here's the specific rules for how you're going to use the water fountain. And it was funny because then they also had it translated in the other language for their students, but I had never seen that right over the drinking fountain before. And they're like, oh, you have no idea the problems that we've had. And again, they used their direct observation data. They were having all kinds of problems and they wanted people to remember how they were supposed to use it. I think it's important too to know that communities can have expectations too. This was taken in one of my local little leagues that my son was in, but this was posted. And I think reminders from your child, I'm just a kid, just a game. My coach is a volunteer, officials are humans, and no college scholarships are going to be handed out today. They are saying, here's basically the expectations of parents when you are watching your child's game. So I think it's important that community, nobody's exempt in this process. This isn't the school. This is actually at the rec center, at the local community playground. But to remind folks, why we're here, what the vision is, and what we can do as spectators of the game. And that's the part where I'm like, I love about PBIS. It's not just a school thing. Like, nobody's exempt. It's not just for one person. So how do you put this all together? So when you guys are using your data and you're looking and saying, okay, where have been our problems? If you've had fighting, if you've had people like come into school late, or they're not doing their homework, whatever it is, let's just say you're wanting folks to be respectful, responsible, and to be safe. Doesn't have to be that, but let's just say your data came up with that. You need to define what that looks like in each of the particular settings. Because again, if we think about going back to that instructional component, we need to be explicit in how we're teaching, what that looks like. That's going to help us and to be able to provide direct feedback to them. It's going to help us and to be able to provide direct feedback and help correct them and provide, so that they understand how they need to do something differently. So, not all school campus is going to be the same. And this is the piece. It's so important to involve the other folks on your campus or within your classroom. Like, what does this look like for us? How are we going to do this? Because again, you're going to want the folks to all get on board with this, but this also helps them understand, all right, being responsible in the hallway, obviously it looks different than what that should be on the bus. Well, let's talk about how that looks different. And then that's going to help us understand how we explicitly teach the students and then help to remind them throughout the way. There's a guide in case you guys have not seen it on the return to school after crisis. There's lots of great information in there. And this example teaching matrix was lifted directly from that guide that we had developed with some other centers late last year. It's important that when it's really clear what you guys are setting up based upon your values and what the school-wide expectations are, that you're really then clear, okay, what that looks like, and then we are being purposeful and going out and teaching these expectations and routines across our campus within those natural settings. There's all kinds of ways. It doesn't have to be formally typed up. It could be that, you know, we're generating it as a group. It could be students are developing their own. This was taken from one of the, I think it was a middle school, on how they wanted to remind everybody of what the rules would be around the restroom. Again, what the classroom expectations would look like. And again, having the kids start to be involved with this process. And then at some point, are you making sure that it's in the language and it's culturally responsive? So the Sherwood Forest one, that's actually out of the Orleans Parish in Louisiana, and they have a really high, not only Hispanic, but also a Vietnamese population as well. So they made sure to cover their bases across all. Other things to think about is how we're creating a behavior teaching matrix for remote instruction. Hybrid is probably here to stay. Whether we like it or not, it probably is. So I think it's important for folks, just because we've gone virtually, okay, it might look different. Obviously, there isn't a hallway, there isn't a bus, but we need to have students understand and know what are the expectations when they're participating in the virtual environment. And you guys probably we all learned this the hard way. Like, none of us had this stuff developed before the pandemic hit. And you had to develop it quickly when everybody was forced, like, boom, starting Monday, everybody is remote. And so we've got to think about, what does that look like? But, you know, parents also, they need to be provided some expectations. We also need to provide some guidance for them of what they can do to provide supports so that their child can be successful as well. But if you clicked on that practice brief of creating a PBIS behavior teaching matrix for remote instruction, I'll take you straight to there. Again, is it culturally responsive? Is it in the language, the predominant language within your school? We've got also a brief on guidance for adapting check-in, check-out for distance learning. So if you did do some check-in, check-out with some students that needed to have some a person, an adult to see to help get them on the right track at the beginning of the morning, and then at the end of the day or throughout the day, there are ways to adapt that when in a hybrid approach. Brian, do you have, you want to elaborate across these next couple of slides?
Yeah, sure. And one thing I saw is there's a couple comments here in chat about, so who has curriculum for this work? And I just want to ask folks to pause for a second. In some ways, you're sort of getting ahead of yourself. You might find that you have curriculum in your school that speaks to social skills or emotional skills or behavioral skills. You might have a wellness module, or you're using Second Step or something. There's lots of curriculum out there. That's not the first question. That's not the hunt. We're not trying to say what's the curriculum. You're trying to say, what are the expectations that we want to achieve? What does the data say about where we're at and the gaps that our students have? And then what do we need to teach? Then you say, now, is skills streaming in high schools the right curriculum that's going to help us achieve these social skills for these expectations? And so that's an important process that you go through. And on a simple level, you can start with writing some of your own. When you have a teaching matrix, which is already shared, that can speak to sort of your curricular standards. Here are the things we want students to learn this year, how to do these things in these settings. And so we can write some lesson plans ourselves. So it's a great question. And that's something that the whole team needs to sort of grapple with. You wouldn't want to just bring a curriculum in and say, I found skills streaming. It's great. Let's do it. Because in a way, we're not really looking at the entirety of the Pbis process of outcomes, data, systems, practices. So in this case, what you're seeing here is an interesting example. This was a middle school, and I was in this school. I was doing direct observations, and this was a 6th grade class. The teacher said, okay, bell to bell teaching, you're going to start with the assignment immediately, and you're going to, once you turn that in, we're going to work on using number properties to simplify expressions. There's your homework for the day. Throughout the period, I'm looking for our Wilson Way expectation of being responsible, focusing on your own work. And then that teacher for the next 42 minutes proceeded to help shape, give students feedback on their math skills, and then periodically would turn and say to a student, hey, Brian, nice job. See your eyes on your own paper. You're showing being responsible, focusing your own work. That's going to help you get your work done before the period's up. And you just hear him prompted throughout. So they already had a curriculum. Part of it was teaching, focus on your own work. It was included. This was a huge takeaway because the teachers across the whole school were putting on their boards their academic goal for the day, but then their behavioral or their social or their emotional. And it gave them an opportunity to teach there. And you want to go to the next slide, Heather? So then once you have a system for teaching, the next component here is now giving feedback. Or how do you, another way of putting that is how do you encourage appropriate behavior? And you'll see there's lots of different ways to do that. These ideas here continually rise to the top of research validated ways. So one is teach the behavior you want to see. If I want students to interrupt a certain way, let me teach them how to interrupt a certain way. Like, what are the pain points you have in your high school? If you want cell phones to be managed in your school a specific way, how often are you teaching that versus just telling kids? Like, how often do they practice the skill of how and where to use technology? So teach it, develop those routines. Then use prompts when needed. Hey, this class is going to start in about 1 minute. Remember the cell phone routine that we have? Please go ahead and start that now. It's a little prompt. Praising students is then where the feedback hits most effective, is where you're meeting students where they're at, you're providing specific praise, and then you also shape behavior where needed, but you're really trying to aim for that 5-to-1 ratio. Human beings are very similar in this way. We can improve our behavior substantially if you start with what we have as our strengths. But if we're only getting performance deficit feedback, it actually disconnects us from the learning process. Then we can talk about reinforcement. So a lot of schools will, call the red hotline phone I have for Pbis emergencies, and it rings on my desk, and then they'll say, we have a problem. We're making it rain tiger tokens in our school, and they aren't working. So again, where does that fit along your continuum? Using a reinforcement system, bulldog bucks or something in our school, really is about reminding the adults their role in giving specific praise for the lessons of the day or the lessons of the week. So those ticket systems can be very effective for a large group of students, but the power is not in the ticket. It's not in the token economy. It's in the interaction between the adult and the student. So a lot of times schools already have it upside down when they think, sometimes people think Pbis is some type of ticket reinforcement system. No, the goal is feedback, and the goal is specific positive feedback where possible. Tickets help remind us to do that sometimes. And then finally, group contingencies. So, hey, if we all achieve this goal at the end of the week, all the fourth grades are going to celebrate together. Or in my classroom, as soon as we earn 10 tiger tokens, we're going to take a 5-minute brain break, choosing from the menu we have on the wall. A lot of those group contingencies are things you want to do anyway in your schools because kids need brain breaks. But you can easily connect them to the pace at which you're recognizing students for the skills they have. So it was a nice little way of kind of showing this layer of how you can build these strategies out with your teachers. And then would you go to the one more slide, Heather? Going back to that kind of reinforcement system. So this was an example of a school in Pittsburgh. It was a high school, urban setting, some pretty complex behaviors. If you could advance it one more time, Heather. They had a digital system, but they recognized that teachers, when using a digital reward system, weren't interacting with students. So that wasn't the intervention. It was just a tracking system. So they went in this high school and they made these little pieces of paper, and each teacher had to use one. And then when they used it, they had a Google form on their smartphone, and within 10 seconds, they could log the student and the location. Then the Google form did the rest. And by doing that, the high school every day at lunch would look at at all the acknowledgements throughout the past 2 weeks, randomly draw 10 kids' names and say, okay, we're going to announce the 10 students of the day. Each of you bring a friend, which is pretty awesome. Come down, we'll give you your fast pass wristband, and you're going to go get to sit in the student lounge. And they made a special student lounge. And every single day, 20 kids went into the lounge, 10 who earned it and 10 who were smart enough to be friends with those 10 kids. But it kept the conversation at the school focused on these 4 things: prepared, on time, respectful, try hard. So it was a whole kind of culture shift at a school. Let's jump into the next slide. Heather, you want to pick it up from here?
Yep. So I was looking at the chat box. Thanks, Brian, for that. And so there's been a lot of great discussion, and some of the things that have come up have been around specific curriculum around different grade levels. And the key that's most important is to think about what are the needs of your campus. So based upon the needs of your campus will help you determine what the expectations should be. Once you've identified what those expectations should be, from there, you're then saying, what does that look like in the particular settings? It could be that you borrow from others that have created a matrice or lesson plans around those areas. It could be that it's a prepackaged curriculum. But again, I think what's important is that you don't always need a prepackaged curriculum or something that costs money in order to teach what's expected. And in fact, the Florida Project, a lot of the folks, we provide them and help them create their own lesson plans around this. But my recommendation for you is, if you're going, okay, this wouldn't work for high school, how do I get the high school teachers to buy into this? Well, you got to think about the first session. We talked about data. What do the data say at high school? What are the needs that are happening? And start to bring folks together to have those conversations of what is it that we would like to see of our high school students. That's how you start to bring people to the table from there. And then you can go into the national database. You can go into the Florida one. You can go into the Midwest one. There's other, Missouri has lots of great stuff as well. And pull up and see where they have examples and different exemplars that may have submitted stuff that have been used. You could borrow that, but keep in mind, it's got to be specific to not only the needs of your school, but to fit your school and what you're putting in that matrix. So just something to pay attention to. There's all kinds of ways of encouraging expectations. And the one big takeaway, if there's anything for you guys to take away from here, is to know that PBIS is not about parties, or not just about reinforcers and we have parties, that type of thing. But what we are talking about is, once we've established what the expectation is and we've taught the expectation, we need to give people a reason to start using this new skill. But if it gets stuck in just this area, keep in mind, behaviors start to be problematic because it's just parties that aren't tied to specific performance feedback. So there's all different ways in how we can recognize it. There's all different ways in which others are being recognized that you may not realize. This one is thank you for kicking tail. That's something that Southwest gives and sends out to folks who've been flying a lot to say, hey, if you see a flight attendant or a captain who has done something great, recognize them, please tell them exactly. And it has the instructions on the back. Tell them exactly what they have done, of why they're kicking tail, and they can turn that in and they're getting a bonus, on their paycheck. So how cool is that? Again, adults like being recognized too. I was recognized when I first started tweeting on our project, because they were trying to get some of the old dogs to get used to some new technology. And surprisingly, I got it, at least for 1 week. All right, this other thing, think about rewarding, how you're acknowledging folks for elementary and secondary students. And again, it also doesn't hurt to ask them what they would prefer to be acknowledged by, but you can click directly on these and it'll take you to these resources. But they all also don't have to cost anything. We've got a brief on effective instruction as a protective factor that you could also refer to, as well as one on how you engage in discussing race, racism, and important current events with students that has a guide with lesson plans and various resources. And so, like I said, the national site, as well as a lot of the state sites, have lots of great information to refer to. As for responding to behavior, we would need to look at what is the operational procedures for that. If a student does misbehave, what's the decision-making process that a teacher should go through? Is it one that they have to determine, based upon this behavior, it's low level, I should be handling this in the classroom. Here are the various things that I'm going to do within the classroom. But if it's a higher level behavior, more intensive, what is the procedure that they're supposed to follow? You know, do they contact the office? Is there a form that's supposed to be filled out? And then what can they expect to occur once that happens? Again, we're just being clear on setting up these operational procedures and the feedback for folks across the board. And responding to behavior isn't always just a negative thing. We're talking about responding to behavior is if students are being appropriate and positive too. What do we do in response to that? It's also important too to start thinking about what is that continuum of strategies to respond to inappropriate behavior, you know, from everything from planned ignoring, not all stuff can be ignored, keep that in mind, but then everything to where we are having more intensive, you know, supports, formal conferencing around the student, or there's a community circle that's done. But there's a long range, and this isn't even fully inclusive of all of the different things that can be done. But it's important that as faculty, we are clear and that they know, like, listen, we always want to be starting with the least intensive, least restrictive response to problem behavior. What are the various things we can do? But also for faculty, what's the expectation for how they're to respond out there on campus? And there's different ways of how we're discussing error correction too. You know, how can you increase specific error correction? How can we make sure that teachers are providing that feedback and not just correcting them and saying, no, don't do that, but then saying, here's what I need you to do next time. Can you practice this for me? Show me this. Because again, practice and that fluency piece does actually change behavior. So some things for you to consider. We've got just 4 minutes left. Is that think about your tier 1 expectations. Again, getting your folks on board for that, and think about what would this look like across your school campus in those different settings. Does anything need to be addressed? So if you do have existing tier 1 expectations, look at it and see, does anything need to be adjusted? You know, occasionally things do need to be revised slightly. You know, what do your data tell you? What is it? How can we describe the behavior? What are the particular settings we definitely need to be focusing on? And again, it might feel like too much to take on the entire school and the different settings. So then figure out, okay, what is our main problem area? If it's the cafeteria, then focus initially on that. Start getting used to this process. You know, how do you guys plan to teach? How are you going to plan to teach the adults first before it's actually rolled out across the students? And then how are you going to bring the families into the mix? So these are all things to talk about. Brian, do you have anything to add related to the polls that folks had completed?
No, if we can just leave that slide up, but let me share that. I looked at the data for the polls, and I think it's very telling. About almost half of the participants said that there's 3 to 5 positive expectations, which is great. So you have, you know, and you might need to revisit those every once in a while, but those should stay pretty consistent over time. And then it gets really interesting, because then we say, but do you teach the expected social, emotional, behavioral skills, number 2? And then it dropped from about half to about 25%. So we have expectations, but are we teaching the skills to get those expectations? 25% of you said you were. Then are we consistently responding to interpreting inappropriate behaviors, what conflicts with those expectations? 4%. And then for classroom practices, are teachers consistent and effective in their classroom practices? Nobody said that you had that in place across your schools. And then acknowledgements. Are we giving feedback to students? It was back to 6%. So what I think the story that this tells is a lot of the questions folks are asking here are, what's the curriculum we should have? Or just kind of give me what's the one thing we could get right now and start doing to make the difference? And what I'm hearing in the data or seeing in this data perhaps is you sort of have some of your own rationales for why you might want to look at a Pbis framework. Staff consistency, that could be your rationale. We just need to do better with this, or we need to make sure that we are deciding what are the classroom practices that will get the behaviors we want and prevent the behaviors that we don't want to see. Those two questions alone could be the rationale for getting started with this work, and then taking your time to train your team so it can make decisions along this whole process.
So the big takeaway, you realize 75 minutes is not enough for us to cover practices. As you learned in the C1, that 75 minutes is not enough to cover everything in data. And we're going to have another 75 minutes to talk about the systems piece, starting at 4 o'clock Eastern time today. So given that we are at the end of this session, and I know that you guys have probably lots more questions, and know that we're trying to give you a brief overview of this, but that if you're wondering, how do I get this, or where is this available in my state? Very last, well, please do the evaluation. But the other thing is the very last slide here. If you click on the very top one at pbis.org and you go to about at the very top of the page and scroll down, it'll say state coordinators. You can click on there and you'll be able to see who is the primary contact within your state, and that they would be able to get you in touch with folks in your state for further information and more intensive training in these particular areas. In the meantime, if you guys do have a chance to fill out the evaluation for C2, please do so. This feedback is extremely helpful, and talk about performance feedback. We actually do look at it and we do make changes on the information that we do receive every single year across every single session. So you do have the exemplars contact information. So if you do want to follow up with them, Brian's my contact information was on the very first slide. And we hope you'll be back in 30 minutes for C3 as we talk about the systems piece. In the meantime, thank you guys. And thank you to our awesome exemplars, Tara, Juan, and Lauren. Thank you very much for being here. And hopefully we'll see you guys back in 30 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.